When our boys walked to their death, risking it all in defence of our sovereignty, little did they think that one day in the future we'd give it all away for free. But we have. And if they could see us now, they let out a distress call. A call that said,
Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!
So, thank you for joining me for this conversation today with Dr. David Starkey, an eminent historian, broadcaster, an academic mind, and a very humorous individual. Sometimes. But today we're here to discuss a very important and seminal topic, which is what's happening to not just our politics in this country, but also our constitution, our historical landmark, as it were, of what it means to really belong to this country, and where we go from here. Are we seeing a change, a new revolution, similar to the one we saw under Tony Blair, or are we seeing a continuancy of that project under Keir Starmer's government? And also, how do we go back in time? Is it possible? David, thank you for joining me today.
Let's establish where we are first. That's the really important thing. There has not been a change of government since 1997. It is as simple and as straightforward as that. In other words, for all the talk of change from Starmer, his government is the direct continuation of the government of Tony Blair, as indeed were all the succeeding ones to a greater or lesser extent. It was perfectly explicit in the case of David Cameron, proclaiming himself the heir to Blair, surrounded by ministers, particularly Michael Gove, who is on record recently in the last few months explaining that he passed marked up copies of Blair's memoirs round the cabinet table as to how to do it book, an alleged Conservative government. Now, probably the most surprising figure, actually, is Cameron's successor, Theresa May. The evidence that's now coming out is truly astonishing. It is Theresa May who, more than anybody else, is responsible for the catastrophe of Ed Miliband. There is a direct line from Theresa May to Ed Miliband because Theresa May legislates net zero, passes with virtually no debate whatever an act of parliament which makes net zero legally binding, with the result, yet another aspect of this extraordinary story, judges determine fuel policy. They determine whether we can drill for oil or whether we can frack or not. It is simply deranged. But really, she does far worse. All the fuss we've been having about non-crime incidents, these are created by Theresa May, quite deliberately, as part of her two things. The so-called positive aspect of it was the detoxification of the Tory Party. In other words, to make it a Tory Party that the Manchester Guardian would endorse. Can you imagine anything more completely stupid? So you embrace the whole equity, diversity, equality, or whatever it's called, inclusion agenda. You embrace critical race theory. You embrace the most extreme reading of the Lawrence Report, declaring that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, and so on. So the things that everybody's saying, completely outrageous, disgracefully unconservative, was conservative. And this, of course, brings us to a terrible realization. The only way conservatism can rescue itself is by admitting what it did, by admitting that there's a wonderful biblical phrase that it whored after strange gods. And dear me, the thought of Theresa May, that awful vicar's daughter, whoring after strange gods. You've really got to see her as Salome in the temple, you know, yes, dancing off the head of John the Baptist, committing, and let's be now serious, committing political whoredom. And it's vital that we understand this. And if the Conservative Party doesn't do it, let me tell you what happens. Ed Miliband, who is not a fool, he may behave like a fool, he is a fanatic, but he's not a fool, points out to Claire Coutinho when she says, you are insisting that if people don't sell enough EVs, you will find them. He said, but that was your policy. I'm astonished Starmer, who, by the way, shows himself really rather ill-informed about law. You may remember he didn't actually realise that spiking drinks was already illegal, so he decided to make it illegal again. What a waste of time. But I'm astonished Starmer hasn't pointed out to the Conservative Party, to the Daily Telegraph, that the party it supported, the party that is now backing loudly its columnist Alison Pearson, is the party responsible for non-crime hate incidents. So in other words, there's got to be a realisation. And you know what? I find myself faintly embarrassed to be saying it. All that stuff about the Uni-Party or Lycon or whatever it is pretty well right.
Now, one of the issues with this, and I'm going to raise up immediately one of the monsters on the political horizon for the Tory party, other than their own problems, which is, of course, the Reform Party. And there was obviously a deputy leader of that party, Ben Habib, who's well known. He was a former Tory. He's recently left that party, saying, among many, many other things, which we won't delve into today, that Reform may be responsible for allowing too many Tories back into their own party. And there is this perception from those who have left the Tory party early on, as it were, and have joined other movements, that to be Tory as a whole is a broken brand. It's not just about the politicians, which we'll go into later on, but it's also about adhering to the flag. Wearing the football shirt of that team is now problematic. So how do we reconcile that new growing factionalism, which is going to divide party lines in a way that perhaps hasn't happened since UKIP was at its heyday?
Much. I mean, I think that the risks are going back to the previous great splits in the Conservative Party. They're going back to free trade at the beginning of the 20th century, to the Corn Laws in the 1830s. And if we don't, as it were, rescue ourselves from that, there will be exactly what happened after the 1830s. The Conservatives will be out of office effectively for decades. In other words, what we've got to do is to recognise that there has to be an act of deliberate goodwill. We are going down completely the wrong approach to this. Everybody is trying to proclaim their heightened purity. Now, as Habib has made perfectly clear with many of the things that he has been saying about Nigel Farage, like any politician, is as tainted by compromise and as ambidexterity as anybody else. What is needed is an honest recognition. It's very simple. May I put the word honest and politician in the? Can we have a genuine fresh start? Yes. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the petition, which the very interesting, rather successful petition, which was launched against Starmer's government, latched onto exactly this point: the fundamental dishonesty. People may be naive, but they somehow still believe it's possible. I may be naive too. I believe it's possible, and I believe it's necessary. And I believe we're going to confront the general sense. I mean, again, we're talking in the New Britain, in this converted warehouse, which is now devoted to the digital industries and all the rest of it. This is a little successful corner. Outside, so much is literally falling to pieces. We have had an MP rising in Parliament demanding a revival of blasphemy laws, effectively to protect a text which throughout the whole of the Christian Middle Ages was regarded literally as the work of the devil. That's to say, the Quran. We are in really dark times. And in dark times, surely, as in 1939, there is still a residual sense that there is more in common and something to be sought in common. And I think it is possible. But the way I would want to approach it is that we try and come up with a broad conservative platform. We don't worry about parties. There will almost certainly have to be a series of coalitions. There will have to be, as there was in 2019, there will have to be electoral pacts, but they will have to be on a much clearer and more defined basis, which I would want to see as actual policy. And we're already beginning to see that. There are stirrings. There were stirrings during the Conservative leadership election. The kind of statements which were emerging from Robert Jenrick went far, far to the right of anything that Farage has said. On things like immigration, he was far clearer. He was far clearer about the European Convention. Kemi Badenoch is now starting to move in the same direction. I think it is inevitable that this will happen. But what we want to do it in a fashion which is open-eyed, which actually recognises what happened. Sure. Because if we go back to the last time that we confronted an issue like this, I've been talking about the things everybody knows about, like Joe Chamberlain and free trade at the beginning of the 20th century, like the Corn Laws and Peel in the 1830s. But remember, there was an equivalent split, and one that had a much happier and much faster outcome in the Conservative Party in the 1970s. I think that the decade that offers the model to where we are now is exactly 50 years ago. In the 1970s. It is exactly 50 years ago that Edward Heath went to the country with the election Who Governs, and I remember I was one of those. I was a young man, I was old enough to do it. I was one of those who returned the vote very smartly, anybody but you. And he fell. Yeah. In the aftermath of that, he clung on for another year, and then there was the appearance of the new Conservative leader, another woman, Margaret Thatcher. By no means fully developed, widely mocked, preposterous taste in clothes, pussy bows, an absurd voice, and remember, a figure who'd been on the left of the Conservative Party. It's really important to understand this. She undoes more grammar schools, dissolves more grammar schools than any other politician. She, as Secretary of State for Education, is the one who administers the coup de grace to that whole system, which benefited me and countless other young men and women of talent like me. But what happened was, it was recognised by an extraordinary figure, someone that we've largely forgotten, but we need to remember, Sir Keith Joseph, that there'd been effectively a continuation of the wartime coalition since 1939. In other words, the Conservative government, which comes in under Churchill after the vast Attlee reforms, which really fundamentally socialised the British economy, that create the NHS, that create at a ruinous time, to try to erect all that on the ruins of a country so badly damaged, so nearly, well, actually bankrupt in the aftermath of war, to introduce it all at once without introducing it gradually on the basis of insurance, and to try to do it all out of current revenue was a preposterous and catastrophic mistake. And also to replace the existing network of thriving hospitals, great teaching hospitals in London, little cottage hospitals in the county towns like the one where I had my operations in 1949, making myself even more ancient, to correct my club feet. All of that was swept away into this over-centralised, very much kind of Ministry of Truth structure. But the Conservatives didn't dissolve it. The Conservatives continued with Keynesian economics. They continued with highly privileged trade unions. They continued with trying to manage those trade unions by prices and incomes policies, by steady inflation of the currency. And it took the collapse of the Heath government on the one hand and the near collapse of the British economy in 1976, when after a budget very similar to the one that we've just had, the Dennis Healey budget, the taxing the rich until the pips squeak, 2 years later we had the IMF in. And it seems to me that's a very real prospect. But what happened with Keith Joseph was he realised, he says it of himself, listen to it, it's so important. This is the key sentence. I had called myself a conservative, but I realised I hadn't been a conservative. I'd been in a government which had called itself conservative, but hadn't done conservative things. And so what he sets about trying to do, and he sets up the Centre for Policy Studies, which has just celebrated its 50th anniversary this year, he sets it up to rediscover what he thought of as conservatism. But what he comes up with is simply free market economics that provides that great powerhouse, intellectual powerhouse of the Thatcher Revolution. So you can see he gets an awful lot right. He realises there has to be a break with the past. He realises there has to be a secure intellectual foundation. And he finds a leader who can deliver on those things. But it's equally important that circumstances then are very different from what they are now. There was profound, we forget how much opposition there was in the Conservative Party to Margaret Thatcher. When Geoffrey Howe delivered his budget, one of the previous chancellors denounced him as a fool. He said, of course there's got to be Keynesian economics. Of course there's got to be prices and incomes policy. This is remodeling. Of course there's got to be prices and incomes policies. Somebody was just resigned as the Chancellor of Oxford. Chris Patten was heading the Conservative Research Department deliberately as an oppositionist cell to Margaret Thatcher. But what Keith Joseph did, he dealt with that on the sly. He didn't call the Centre for Policy Studies, let's have lots of free market economics. He called it something as bland and neutral. But you see, he could get away with it because there wasn't a reform.
Yes.
We're in a completely different world, which is why I think the whole approach that Kemi Badenoch is adopting, although it's very well intentioned, is wrong. She's thinking she's got a lot of time. She doesn't. She's also saying, oh, we don't want to come out with policies. She must. What we've got to do is to come up with a clear, comprehensive platform that recognises what went wrong and it's a very long stretch, from 1997 to, I'm afraid, 2024, and what has to be done to put it right.
All that you've talked about throughout the 20th century and even now, in my eyes, is a reaction to crisis. It's a scurrying around of the ant's nest because someone's poured water on it. And
how else does change happen? I mean,
there's not much recouping.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly,
Look, human being, we are complacent. You may not be, but most human beings are deeply complacent creatures. This is why history is a series of crises. There's also a very highly developed theory of change in the natural sciences, which is called the Kuhnian model of change, called paradigmatic change. For very, very long periods, scientific models continue even though the facts change quite dramatically. The famous model is the model of the Ptolemaic universe, that's to say, the universe being centered on the Earth rather than heliocentric, and going round the sun. And it lasts for nearly 1,500 years. Well, it lasts for about 2,000 years, despite all the evidence. And it's only at the end, when there's a complete crisis and it's just really jolly difficult to fit everything in, at which point the change comes staggeringly quickly. And I think political change is very, very similar to that, which again is why so much of our history are these long periods where not much happens. You remember the famous phrase that there are years where nothing happens, and there are days where everything happens.
Yes.
And it seems to me we're at one of those moments of inflection. Again, it expresses itself by the rise of odd individuals. The crisis that's going on in Britain is, on the one hand, highly specific, because of the nature of peculiar nature of Britain. Remember, what's odd about Britain is we were the pioneer of modernity, but we are a pre-modern state, a multinational monarchy, a union of kingdoms. But at the same time, we are the great pioneer of modernity. But what you can see is all over the world, very similar phenomena are happening. And the most obvious example of that crisis embodying itself in an individual in the same way that we think of the end of the Ptolemaic universe as being Kepler. Obviously, Donald Trump embodies that moment of crisis in American politics, in the American Constitution, in the history of the Republican Party, where again there had been, remember, America is an offshoot of Britain. It's the first daughter of Britain, with absolute fundamental continuities, again, the essential structure of the two-party system, where really from the late exactly the 1980s onwards, the two parties had moved so closely together, which was strikingly exemplified in the American election, for example, with the way in which the most extreme of the Republican neoconservatives, people like the former Vice President, Dick Cheney, support Kamala Harris. I mean, completely extraordinary, what one would have thought of as marriage of opposites. So I think, A, the change can happen, and B, that it will happen, or we're finished.
Now, just to go back to the crisis point, I think something happened in the 20th century that hadn't happened before in history, which is the advancement of the capability that the government had to seize on opportunity of change. And of course, that was exemplified by technology. And I think what Keith Joseph and others did in particularly the 60s and 70s, is realise how fast the world started to move and took a step back very consciously, not for long, but certainly for long enough to formulate a policy platform that took a step back from consideration of what I'd call an early sort of seeping Anglo-futurism that was happening at the time, which was everything's about progress, man. But it wasn't, okay, and they understood that. And so they took a step back from the hurly-burly of political life, trying to adapt to change, and actually start to say, well, what can we undo before we move forward?
I think you may have discovered a thing called conservatism.
Exactly, and that's what I wanted to get onto.
I think, I could see the idea struggling to the surface as you were speaking. Again, progressive, let's be quite clear what the whole right side of history, Blairite, or indeed Keynesian stuff is. It is that, on the whole, change is a good thing. And change delivers progress, and progress moves in one direction, and we should be on the side of it. There is, in fact, an enormous amount of evidence that change, especially quick and ill-thought-through change, is absolutely catastrophic. But there's a subtler point. and by a much, much subtler politician than either of us. The effective founder of the modern Conservative Party, Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli has, remember, the 19th century in its own way is vastly more radical progress than ours. I mean, I am born at the very beginning, 80 years ago, at the age of jet travel. Now, yes, clearly, what goes on with supersonic travel is much more, but it's the same sort of super fast thing. The railway, as a comparison with a horse or riding, is infinitely greater change. This is the thing that actually forces a country to have a single time, which you'd never needed before. And so on. The telegraph has the same effect on a worldwide basis, and so on. So this notion then that of change was absolutely there in the 19th century, and Disraeli summarizes it brilliantly. He says, in a progressive country like Britain, there will be change. But the important thing is not that there will be change, but how you change. And there is two sorts of change. One is change in accordance with abstract ideas, the abstract ideas of liberalism, of universal equality, freedom, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or there is change in accordance with the deep-rooted traditions and patterns and behaviours and sympathy of your people. And it's the latter change that works. Because you see, there's something else that we've really got to get into people's heads. Because of this childish progressivism, people have been persuaded that the world before 1997 was this sort of Stygian gloom in which we lived in desperate poverty, and nobody had any rights, and we were the serfs of an oppressive aristocracy. This is the most absolute, preposterous untruth. England and Britain, especially from the late 17th century onwards, invent modernity. The enormous revolution in the natural sciences, in commerce, in naval engineering, that deliver the British Empire, that create the Industrial Revolution, that create the revolutions in medicine, in education, in virtually everything else you can think of, happen here. And the reason they happen here is because of things that actually go right back to the Middle Ages. Again, we've got to get into people's heads. It's why history matters so much. Historically, England, and I'm now using England deliberately, not true of Wales, not true of Scotland, not true of Ireland, was overall, in terms of average wealth of the population, one of the very richest, if not the richest areas of Europe. I'm not talking about the small areas like the Netherlands or the Italian city-states. I'm talking about the actual kingdoms. And the reason for that is our political structure. What we've got to do, we spend all, very much, isn't it, following on even from Keith Joseph, following on from Bill Clinton. Oh, it's the economy stupid. Actually, it's not. The thing that shapes the destiny of nations is their politics. The economics depends on the politics. Look at China, look at Russia, look. The world is adopting similar kinds of technology. It is, therefore, according to Marx, should have produced similar societies, but oh no, it's not. No. The politics are...
In fact, they become radically more different.
And indeed, they become radically more different. Yeah. So we've got to get back to the absolute fundamental. It is politics, which in the wonderful words of the Greeks, Aristotle, whom we should be teaching much more, is architectonic. It shapes like the great speech that's given by Pericles over the Athenian fallen in battle with Sparta, in which he says, it's our constitution, it's the nature of our democracy that makes us who we are, that makes us, that makes us free, that makes us rich, that makes us good neighbours, that makes us cultivated. And the English understood that at a very early point. And it's this bizarre thing. We were both a monarchy and a republic. Our kings had to serve. Our kings were there to serve a purpose. They were the essential guarantors of legal order. And what we do, we needed them to be very strong. Why did we have, until the Equality Act, equality before the law, the wonderful paradox of what's happened under Blair in the way that words have actually been stood on their head. Why did we have equality before the law? Because we had kings strong enough to impose their law on everybody. But at the same time, a nation strong enough to say to the king, you've got to get our agreement before we'll pay you any taxes. And this combination of a very strong monarchy on the one hand and strong representative institutions on the other, it's that Goldilocks of the English medieval culture, which creates both a very powerful central government on the one hand, but one that can't simply tax its subjects to death, and that produces the security of a legal system combined with a relatively weak family structure, already a very high degree of individualism, that provides that amazing, it's a kind of Petri dish, the kind of thing in which you grow specimens. It's the Petri dish in which early capitalism develops. And that's why it all happens here first. In other words, we're uniquely fortunate. The Anglosphere, that's to say, the countries that derive from us, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, to a lesser extent, India, very strongly, Israel, the United States of America, these all benefit from this basic foundation, which is why they represent, I still think, that beaming light in the world. The light has been obscured, terrible things have been done to it, awful sort of flares and damage. If you can think of it as a lighthouse, the beam has been interrupted, the glass has been broken and whatever, but it's still there. It still stands.
Yes.
We've got to rescue it.
And you've identified the problem, which is constitutional change, and we've spoken about
change is the wrong word.
Constitutional
vandalism.
Yes, vandalism.
Let's get the right word.
Backdoor to cultural regicide.
You see, again, a model. Let me just quickly.
Yes.
Because one of the best ways you can think about things is buildings. Why is our Houses of Parliament, Palace of Westminster, built to look medieval? Because the liberties it enshrines weren't the creation of a single constitution, the single actual, you were talking about a single crisis.
Physical document.
They were the creation of a long period of time. They're actually, in the most fundamental sense of the word, they are a cultural acquisition. So let's have that idea of building. Then let's look at what happens when you do the opposite. When you decide you want instant change, we want everything to be new. Look at the horror of our rebuilt cities after the Second World War. I would say that the catastrophe of provincial Britain is largely because of the insistence of the Labour government and Labour-run local authorities of rebuilding quickly and in a new style with inadequately understood materials and a trashy architectural vocabulary.
That leads to the Barbican.
The Barbican isn't quite the case you want, because the Barbican demonstrates that the worst council estate can function providing it's lived in by the rich. It's why New York works.
Yeah.
Impossible buildings can work, providing those who live in them are very, very rich. What you can't have is ordinary people living with lifts because their children and pets pee in them and they go wrong, and everything else happens. But the disaster of post-war Britain is the disease of the new. The determination that we were going to make it all new. It was catastrophic. There's a disease, there's actually a name for the disease. It's called neophilia, and it's very, very dangerous.
So my final question, because we could talk all day, is now that we've identified the problem, and also I believe you've identified a solution, with your abounding remaining energy to do something about political change, even at your dignified age, how are we going to change things concisely and radically enough in the short space of time we've got left available to us before we face utter ruin?
I think fundamentally it's a campaign of public education. That what we have to do, we've to have explained to people. There is a desperate sense, and do you know what? I think people grasp it intuitively. Take the riots, which even Nigel Farage and Tice tried to distance themselves from, carefully washing their hands and dabbing their noses like Cardinal Wolsey with his scented orange. What was the cry of the rioters? We want our country back. There's a sense people have been robbed, that they know something has gone. They know something that they valued has gone. We've got to explain what went. We've got to point out that we used to have laws that we felt were ours. Because if you vote for an MP, the laws are passed by MPs, aren't they? But oh no, they're not since Tony Blair. Since Tony Blair, more and more political decisions have been hived off to quangos. More and more decisions have been hived off to the law courts. More and more has been hived off internationally. You've even done something inconceivable in Britain. You've said the law is above Parliament. That means the lawyers are above the people. Now, again, this is an immense task of explanation because, of course, particularly with the expenses scandal, the contempt which enveloped MPs, but if we're to rescue ourselves, if we go down our current route, we will simply dissolve into warring factions. And we've got worse things. We've got the elements of direct communal strife, with a large and, in many ways, to significant extent and in significant parts, utterly unassimilated, if not directly hostile, Muslim population. MPs now are openly represented, and there will be many more as the Labour government begins to disintegrate. The possibility for communal violence is terrifying. So what we've got to do, we've to stop quarrelling with each other. We've got to recognise that this is a moment of genuine national crisis. It would enormously help if a leader were able to emerge that could actually talk common language, directly, sensitively, without hectoring, in ordinary words, because I believe passionately that most people, virtually everybody, can understand what matters to them. We have had, again, part of the terrifying Blair legacy is a contempt for ordinary people. The Emily Thornberry, the sneer for the common folk. I'm afraid even Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. I don't like those sneers. I came from that world. My father was a tool maker. He didn't own a factory, unlike another chap who was the son of a tool maker. I came from that world. They understood. They understand. They can be addressed. We need that. And so much has got lost, which is why there is that. I think Joseph, I'm speaking quietly and less fluently than I normally do. There's a terrible tense sense of sadness. There's a terrible sense of loss, of realization of what's gone wrong. But I think that realization can be, should be, must be the foundation for doing something about it.